There is a cry that does not come from the lips alone, but from the deepest place within the soul, a cry that cannot be manufactured, a cry that is born when everything else has failed to satisfy. It is the quiet, desperate longing to be emptied of everything that stands between the heart and God. Not a surface-level desire, not a temporary emotion, but a deep awareness that self has occupied too much space for too long. It is the realization that pride has spoken too loudly, that personal desires have taken the lead, that hidden motives have shaped decisions more than the gentle leading of the Spirit, and in that moment, a person begins to see themselves not through the lens of others, but through the light of truth. Every effort to appear strong begins to fade. Every attempt to maintain control starts to feel heavy, and the soul becomes aware of its own limitations. There is no longer a need to pretend, no longer a need to justify, because the presence of God reveals everything with clarity. What once felt acceptable now feels like a barrier. What once seemed small now feels significant. And the heart begins to hunger for something deeper than routine or habit, and this cry for emptiness is not comfortable. It requires honesty that most try to avoid. It requires a willingness to let go of identity built on personal strength, to release the need to be right, to surrender the desire to be seen or recognized. It is an inward breaking, a gentle yet undeniable awareness that the life built on self cannot carry the weight of what God desires to pour out. The soul begins to understand that as long as it is full of its own thoughts, its own ambitions, its own control, there will never be enough room for divine fullness, and there is a sacred tension in this place, a pulling away from what is familiar and a drawing toward what is eternal. The heart may resist at first, clinging to what it knows, holding tightly to what feels safe, but the deeper the awareness grows, the more impossible it becomes to remain the same. The cry intensifies, not out of fear, but out of longing. A longing to be free from the constant striving, to be released from the pressure of maintaining an image, to be delivered from the quiet exhaustion of living in self-effort. And as this cry continues, something begins to shift within. The soul starts to loosen its grip. The hands that once held tightly begin to open. The heart that once resisted begins to yield. There is no performance here, no need to impress, only a quiet surrender that says, take everything that is not of you, remove every hidden thing, strip away every layer that does not reflect your nature, and it is in this place that true emptiness begins, not as loss, but as preparation. A clearing of space, a removal of obstacles, a laying down of everything that once stood as a substitute for His presence. The soul does not yet fully understand what will follow, but it knows that what is being released is necessary, that what is being surrendered is worth more than what is being held on to, and that this cry, though costly, is leading to something far greater than anything self could ever produce. There is a subtle danger in holding on to self, because it does not always appear as rebellion or open resistance. Often it hides behind good intentions, behind habits that feel normal, behind thoughts that seem harmless. A person can speak about surrender, can desire transformation, and yet still cling tightly to their own understanding, their own preferences, their own sense of control. It is not always loud or obvious, but it is present, quietly shaping decisions, influencing reactions, and limiting the depth of what God desires to do within the heart, and self has a way of convincing you that it is necessary, that without it you will lose something important, that letting go will leave you vulnerable or empty in the wrong way. It whispers that your plans are safer, that your timing is better, that your way of handling things is more reliable. And without realizing it, a person begins to trust themselves more than they trust the leading of the Spirit. The dependence shifts, not outwardly where others can see, but inwardly where it matters most, and this is where the danger begins to grow. Because anything that takes the place of full dependence on God becomes a barrier, even if it looks acceptable on the surface. You may still pray, still believe, still seek, but there is a limitation, a boundary that self has quietly established. It says you can go this far, but no further. You can surrender this area, but not that one. You can trust here, but not completely, and so the life becomes divided, partially yielded, partially held back. There is movement, but not fullness. There is growth, but not transformation. The presence of God may be felt, but not in its depth, not in its fullness, because self is still occupying space that belongs to Him. It is like trying to fill a vessel that is already crowded, where there is no room for the overflow because something else refuses to be removed, and holding on to self also creates a constant tension within the soul. There is a desire for more of God, yet a resistance to letting go of what stands in the way. There is a longing for peace, yet an attachment to control. There is a hunger for freedom, yet a fear of release. This inner conflict can become exhausting, because the spirit is being drawn in one direction while self is pulling in another, and over time, this can lead to a quiet frustration, a sense that something is missing even when everything appears to be in place. The prayers are spoken, the routines are followed, but there is a depth that remains untouched, not because God is withholding, but because self is withholding, not because He is distant, but because there is something in the way that has not yet been surrendered, and the danger is not only in what self does, but in what it prevents. It keeps the heart from fully yielding, from fully trusting, from fully stepping into the unknown where God's power is most evident. It limits the flow of His presence, not by force, but by occupation. As long as self remains on the throne, even in small ways, it will continue to direct, to influence, to restrain what could have been a life fully immersed in the Spirit. True surrender is not a single moment spoken with the lips. It is a continual yielding of the heart, a posture that goes beyond words and reaches into the deepest layers of the will. It is easy to say, "I surrender," when emotions are stirred or when circumstances feel overwhelming. But real surrender is revealed in what a person does when the feeling fades and the choice still remains. It is seen in the quiet decisions, in the hidden places where no one else is watching, where the heart must choose between holding on and letting go of control is one of the most difficult parts of surrender, because control gives a false sense of security. It makes a person feel safe, as though they are managing outcomes, protecting themselves from uncertainty, and shaping their own path. But control is also a weight, a constant pressure to maintain, to fix, to understand everything before moving forward. It keeps the mind restless and the heart guarded, always calculating, always trying to stay one step ahead, and the call to surrender challenges this deeply rooted need. It invites the soul to release its grip, to trust beyond what can be seen, to step into a place where outcomes are no longer dictated by personal effort. This is not passive, it is not careless, but it is a deliberate choice to place confidence in something greater than self. It requires humility, because it acknowledges that human understanding is limited, that personal strength is insufficient, and that there is a wisdom far beyond what the mind can comprehend, and there is often a struggle in this process, a hesitation that rises when the heart realizes what surrender will cost. It may mean releasing long-held plans, letting go of expectations that have been carefully built over time, or trusting God in areas where fear has always held influence. The mind may question, the emotions may resist, and the familiar comfort of control may try to pull the soul back into its old patterns, and yet the deeper the person goes, the more they begin to see that control has never truly provided the peace it promised. It may have created a sense of order, but not rest. It may have offered structure, but not freedom. True rest is found when the need to manage everything is replaced with trust, when the pressure to understand everything is lifted, and when the heart becomes still enough to follow rather than lead. And surrender is not about losing direction. It is about receiving a higher direction. It is not about becoming empty without purpose, but about making room for a purpose that is not limited by human perspective. As control is released, the heart becomes more sensitive, more aware, more open to the gentle leading of the Spirit. Decisions begin to flow from a place of peace rather than pressure, from a place of trust rather than fear, and in this ongoing act of letting go, something within begins to change. The need to grasp begins to fade, the urgency to control begins to quiet, and the soul finds itself resting in a confidence that does not come from knowing every detail, but from knowing the one who holds it all. There is a sacred principle that often goes unnoticed, that fullness is not given where there is no room to receive it. A vessel must first be made available, cleared of what occupies it, before it can be filled with something greater. In the same way, the heart must be prepared, not through outward effort alone, but through an inward yielding that creates space for the Holy Spirit to dwell freely. Many desire His presence, many seek His power. Yet few understand that the condition of the heart determines the measure of what can be received, and making room is not about striving harder or doing more. It is about allowing less of self to remain. It is a quiet, intentional process where the soul begins to recognize what is taking up space within. Thoughts that are constantly centered on self, desires that pull attention away from God, attachments that compete with His voice. All of these become obstacles that limit the flow of His presence. They may not seem significant at first, but over time they form a barrier, filling the heart with noise and distraction, leaving little room for the stillness where His voice is heard, and the Holy Spirit does not force His way into crowded spaces. He does not compete with the noise, nor does He override the will. He moves where He is welcomed, where there is openness, where the heart is willing to release what hinders His work. This is why making room requires honesty, a willingness to look within and acknowledge what has been allowed to remain. It may be hidden attitudes, unspoken fears, or patterns of thinking that have become familiar. Whatever it is, it must be brought into the light, not with condemnation, but with a desire to be free from anything that restricts His presence. And as the heart begins to release these things, there is a noticeable shift. The inner atmosphere changes. What once felt heavy begins to lighten. What once felt crowded begins to open. There is a growing awareness of His nearness, not because He has moved closer, but because the obstacles that once clouded that awareness are being removed. The soul becomes more sensitive, more attuned, more capable of recognizing the gentle movements of the Spirit. And this process is not always immediate, nor is it always easy. There are layers within the heart that are revealed over time, areas that may not have been recognized before. But with each step of yielding, with each act of letting go, more space is created. The desire for His presence begins to outweigh the desire to hold on to anything else. What once seemed valuable begins to lose its hold, and what once felt necessary begins to fade in comparison to the peace that comes from His presence. And making room is also a matter of priority. It is choosing to value His presence above distractions, above personal agendas, above anything that would divide the heart. It is a conscious decision to create space, not just in moments of prayer, but in the daily rhythm of life. The mind becomes quieter, the heart more focused, the spirit more open, and in that openness, there is a readiness, a quiet anticipation that comes from knowing that the more room that is made, the more He will fill. Not in a way that overwhelms without purpose, but in a way that brings clarity, peace, and a deeper awareness of His reality within. There is a mystery in the way God works within the surrendered heart, a divine exchange that does not follow human logic, where what is given up is never truly lost, and what is received cannot be produced by human effort. It begins in a place of weakness, where the soul becomes aware of its own inability, where strength feels insufficient and self-reliance begins to crumble. This is often the place people try to avoid, the place where control slips and confidence in oneself begins to fade. Yet it is here that something sacred begins to unfold, and human nature resists weakness. It seeks to cover it, to compensate for it, to push through it with determination and effort. But the more a person strives to overcome weakness through their own strength, the more they find themselves exhausted, carrying a weight they were never meant to bear. There is a limit to what self can sustain, a boundary that cannot be crossed no matter how strong the intention may be. And it is in reaching that limit that the heart is faced with a choice, to continue striving or to surrender, and the divine exchange begins when surrender is chosen over striving, when the soul stops trying to prove its strength and instead acknowledges its need. This acknowledgement is not defeat, it is an opening, a doorway through which the strength of the Holy Spirit begins to flow. What once felt like a disadvantage becomes the very place where His power is revealed. Weakness is no longer something to hide, but something to present, not with shame, but with trust. And as this exchange takes place, there is a shift that cannot be explained by natural means. Strength begins to rise, not from within the self, but from a source that is constant and unchanging. It does not come with pressure, it does not demand performance. It simply flows, steady and sufficient for whatever is needed. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to lose their weight, not because they have changed, but because the source of strength within the person has changed, and this strength is different from anything the world offers. It is not driven by emotion, nor is it dependent on circumstances. It remains steady even when everything around seems uncertain. It enables a person to endure without becoming weary, to stand without being shaken, to move forward without being consumed by fear. It is quiet, yet powerful, gentle, yet unyielding, and in this exchange, weakness is not erased, it is transformed. It becomes a channel through which His power continues to flow. The areas that once felt like limitations become places of dependence, constant reminders that the strength being carried is not self-generated. This keeps the heart humble, aware, and continually surrendered, and as this pattern continues, the soul begins to trust more deeply, not in its own ability, but in the faithfulness of the One who provides. The need to rely on self diminishes, replaced by a confidence that does not fluctuate with circumstances. There is a growing assurance that no matter what is faced, the strength given will be enough, not because of personal capacity, but because of the ongoing exchange that takes place whenever weakness is laid down and His power is received. Transformation through His presence is not a surface level change, nor is it something that can be achieved through effort, discipline, or determination alone. It is a deep, inward work that begins when the heart is exposed to the living presence of the Holy Spirit, where light reveals what darkness once concealed, and truth begins to reshape the very foundation of a person's life. This transformation does not simply adjust behavior, it renews the mind, softens the heart, and redirects the entire course of a person's existence. And when the presence of God becomes more than an occasional experience, and instead becomes a continual reality, something begins to shift in the inner man. The desires that once dominated begin to lose their grip, not through force, but through the introduction of something far greater. The heart starts to develop new affections, new priorities, new sensitivities. What once felt important begins to fade, and what once seemed insignificant begins to carry weight. This is not a forced change, but a natural response to being in the presence of something pure and holy, and transformation happens in layers, often quietly, sometimes without immediate recognition. A person may not even realize how much they are changing until they look back and see that their reactions are different, their thoughts are different, their responses are no longer driven by the same impulses as before. This is the evidence of His presence at work, not just visiting, but dwelling. Not just touching, but transforming, and the mind is one of the first areas to be affected. Thoughts that once were restless begin to settle. Patterns that once were negative begin to be replaced with truth. There is a renewing that takes place, a shifting of perspective that allows a person to see beyond natural limitations and into the reality of what God is doing. This renewal brings clarity, peace, and a deeper understanding that cannot be learned through human reasoning alone, and the heart also undergoes a transformation, becoming more sensitive, more open, more responsive. Where there was once hardness, there is now softness. Where there was once resistance, there is now willingness. The presence of God has a way of breaking through defenses that were built over time, not by force, but by love. It gently removes layers of hurt, fear, and self-protection, replacing them with trust, surrender, and a growing awareness of his nearness, and even the way a person walks in daily life begins to change. Decisions are no longer made purely based on logic or emotion, but are influenced by a deeper awareness of his guidance. There is a dependence that develops, a continual turning of the heart toward him, a sensitivity to his leading in both small and significant matters. This is not a one-time event, but an ongoing transformation, where each moment spent in his presence continues to shape, refine, and align the soul with his nature, and through it all, the most profound change is not what is seen externally, but what is formed internally. A life that once reflected self begins to reflect him, not through imitation, but through transformation that flows from being continually immersed in his presence.